Welcome. This is certainly an unusual way to give a presentation. Right now I can see everybody in a grid pattern, and then I think momentarily you all become a little column. So forgive any technical glitches or any weirdnesses. I've done at least one webinar so far through the pandemic, and then another couple of events and recordings and things. So I'm getting a little bit better at looking at the camera and being mindful of this weird space, but I'm no pro by any stretch. So forgive any screw ups there. But hopefully it'll go off without a hitch. I did put together a PowerPoint, and it is not an elaborate PowerPoint by any stretch. It was just the simplest way to get the poems in front of everybody, and also just to kind of organize my thoughts and the order in which things are going. And if I have to get up at any point, it's because directly above me, above this computer, are all my poetry books, and so I may like jump up and grab a book every now and again to read something from. So for anybody who was there last year, this is a little bit different. I didn't like write an essay or do anything that formal. What I thought I would do when I first pitched this as my craft talk, it's called Meditations in an Emergency, and that takes its title from a very famous book and poem by Frank O'Hara. And I had I'd sent a few essays out for everybody to consider and look at. If you didn't have a chance, it's not a big deal. We're not going to do any kind of quiz or any elaborate deep dive into those essays. I wanted you to see those more or less as a context for what I was going to talk about. What I didn't know at that time was that what felt in that moment like a singular crisis of coronavirus and 5 billion people on lockdown has, thanks to exquisite leadership in this country and elsewhere, snowballed into multiple crises, and then there are a lot of events that are unrelated to the pandemic that have made the notion of meditations in an emergency feel like it should be pluralized to meditations in many emergencies. So that changed my thought on how to approach this talk. Initially, I was going to kind of focus on reminding all of us to deploy things like humor and think about totality of subject as opposed to focusing only on the misery or the danger or the scary stuff. And so in the way that events have turned and things have changed, I've decided to make this a bit of a broader craft talk, one that that I'm certain Victoria and Dan and others who are, any of you who are very well read and have a long history with poetry will recognize that the things that I'm going to be describing are actually applicable quite broadly across subject matter in poetry. They end up, the moment of crisis ends up being an opportunity to look at the various ways in which poems are constructed. And so that's what I decided to do with this. And one of the reasons I wanted to do it this way is to give all of you a toolkit, because I have a feeling, knowing the sort of social justice sensibility and mission of the Antioch program, and knowing some of the students here, I'm certain, like me, you're probably pretty eager to write about a lot of the things that are going on out there in the world right now. And so it's an interesting moment. It is not the moment that I came into my MFA program in 2001 in, and that moment was in 2001 it was sort of lyric confession had become very unfashionable, and formal and conceptual experiment was very much on the upswing, and there was that tension throughout the MFA world of sort of experimental versus conventional poetry. A lot has changed in the 20 years since I began my MFA, and so what I wanted to do is take a step back and look at the kinds of poetic tools that are available to all of us when we sit down to write about any subject. And in this case, that subject is crisis. So With that, I'm going to share my screen, which will bring up the PowerPoint. And again, for any of you who are pros at PowerPoint or Prezi, you will not be impressed with the sophistication of this particular PowerPoint presentation, but it should get the job done. I'm going to be mindful of time. I actually crammed a little bit more into this than I had, a few more poems than I had originally planned, and so it's going to be tough for me to like read all the poems and do a close reading or deep analysis of each. What I'm going to do is present the poems and talk about the overarching craft ideas, the elements of craft behind them that make them potentially really useful in whatever subject we take on. So the talk is called Meditations in an Emergency on Crisis and Poetry, and I had to include a content warning, which it didn't really dawn on me until late last night that I needed to do that, because these are crises, and the subject matter in a lot of these poems is tough. They're not poems that are obscure either. You're going to recognize several of these. So so the content warning, though, when I started to write it, I realized, oh my God, there's a lot happening in these 6 poems that we're looking at, and a lot of really tough subject matter. But I think what I'm amazed by is how, even in light of this a rather bulky content warning, the reason it didn't occur to me till late to include it was because I'm so overwhelmed by the kind of craft and just sheer necessity of these poems, that even if they take on difficult subject matter, they're poems that are very much worth knowing and reading. So I don't think anyone's going to be offended by anything in any of the poems, I hope. But I just wanted to be mindful that there is subject matter here that may be triggering or difficult for members of the audience. So with that, this is the structure of the talk, and I'll when I jump ahead. Oh, where did there it is. Okay, sorry, I jumped over. So the poems that this presentation contains, they do describe or make reference, and this is not in any particular order, but to suicide, the war in Vietnam, racial stereotypes, the assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, the murders of Black men by police, the death of loved ones, and the graphic details of war. One of the things that I thought was really kind of important about including this warning too was to also give us a sense of the breadth and scope of subject matter that poetry takes on. And as sort of strangely intimidating as this warning is, I think and I hope that by the time we get through the poems, you'll realize just how adept poetry is at taking on these subject matters and affecting us without harming us, if that makes sense. And so with that, I'm going to move to the next slide, which is, this is the organization of the talk. And I put this at the outset just so you kind of be able to locate where you are as we go through it. So I just have one poem per model that I'm going to present here. And I thought for a while of including other poets to reference, but then it just became a reading list that was like, that would have been dozens and dozens of poets long, and I didn't think that was particularly useful. At that point, I was going to say, just, get a library card and start reading poetry. So the first part is The Crisis as Witnessed, and this is a documentary model of poetry. And the reason I wanted to start here is because this is an interesting kind of poetry that it feels at once old and very new. In this realm of writing, you find a lot of different elements deployed in really fascinating kinds of ways, from found text to imagery, to reportage, the kind of thing where in all of these, the thing that becomes most evident is that the poet becomes quite minimized. The poet acts as a kind of filter who is simply there to select the details or artifacts that they want to present to you. And I couldn't really think of a better place to start that than with Claudia Rankine's really well-known recent book, Citizen, which, though the cover and other things suggest that it's spurred by the murder of Trayvon Martin, she takes on so many different elements of race and the Black American experience in, throughout U.S. history, but certainly in recent decades. In this book, what we find it's very much a hybrid book. There are works of art throughout, there are photographs, there are essays, there appear to be sort of dialogues or narrations written for film or staged productions. There are lists, there are other kinds of artifacts that she brings in. The one that has that sort of has stayed with me very much the longest from this book is one 2-page spread, which is this one. And it was written, obviously, it was compiled several years ago. The artifact itself is sort of self-evident, right? And the way that this is laid out by the designers of the book and by Claudia Rankine herself is really kind of just an accomplishment, a feat of craft that I think I wanted to take a moment to look at without overshadowing the subject matter. But the way that she has the names listed on the one side of the page with this very simple 3-line statement on the other. The thing that strikes me about this is, of course, the horrific reality that this list continues to be populated weekly, daily, and certainly has once again become the very focal point of a cultural moment and a reckoning that is long overdue. The thing that I want to point out from the perspective of craft when it comes to this kind of documentary poetics is the way in which the speaker is not visible. And this is something that I feel for some reason, we're not necessarily temperamentally inclined towards this move as poets to literally remove ourselves from the poem. We are often, we start our poems with I saw this, I did this, I felt that. This kind of approach, this documentary approach, chooses to leave the I out. Now, it should be pointed out that Rankine does not do that throughout the book, but she certainly does it in several of the pieces, especially ones where there is dialogue and found text and things of that nature. And certainly when it comes to presenting a photograph or something like that, which she will then analyze. The other thing that the consequence of this kind of compositional move is, aside from removing the I from the forefront, it also puts the subject matter in the foreground. It tells you what to focus on. And in that sense, it's an extremely reverent and respectful way of taking on a subject. I wanted to remind us of this as a possibility as we look out at our current landscape that is so very deeply connected to the landscape of this poem, and just sort of remind ourselves that whatever the crisis is, that it isn't necessarily about us. The poet isn't necessarily there to talk exclusively about how they feel about things. Sometimes the poet is just there to observe, to, as I say, witness the crisis itself. So that's where I wanted to start. And I think from there, unless there is any major question, I just thought I would present that at the outset. And from there, we can advance to a slightly different way of doing this. And by the way, the one thing I wanted to mention is that sitting on my desk like right now, another wonderful writer who does things like this is Evie Shockley. I think of Salma Sharif's book, Look, which takes all kinds of documents related to the so-called war on terror and uses found text and this kind of documentary style to present its subject in a really stark and moving way. And I think the last word I would want to say about this is that there is a way in which poetry is a kind of music-making argument, right? There's a way in which there's an artistry to it, but it's still there to take a position. What's amazing about Citizen by Claudia Rankine is the way in which she doesn't really need to argue much of anything. She simply presents the subject, and it becomes undeniable in that presentation. There is a way in which there's no argument that anybody could come up with, you know, as a counter to this. And I think that's really the potency of this kind of documentary poetics. Another poet who very famously deploys a kind of documentary poetics is Carolyn Forche, who is, you know, had a history as kind of a journalistic poet. And she also often, the eye is very much a repertorial eye. It's just a kind of invisible speaker who's there to observe. So the next mode of taking on any kind of big subject is the lyric model. And this is, I'm describing this as the crisis as felt, meaning the crisis is felt by the individual. This is probably the sort of dominant form of American poetry, Anglo-American poetry, since the dawn of Romanticism. So this is like an idea that is maybe 300 years old by now. And it's one that'll seem very familiar to us, that whatever is going on over there, the speaker in the poem acts as the kind of audience identified character moving through that crisis. And we get, unlike the documentary style, here we actually get some insight into the inner monologue of the writer, of the speaker. And actually I do want to make that distinction clear, that there is a difference between writer and speaker, right? What's happening to the eye in the poem is not necessarily happening to the writer of the poem. But this is a really close relationship between the eye of the poem and the eye of the writer. And what we get to see is how that person is experiencing whatever the crisis may be. Oops. So for this, I wanted to turn to one of my very favorite poems of all time, and I mean that like in a really, it was one of the first poems that I ever read that like hurt me, but also left me so impressed with what the writer had done, and that's Preface to a 20-volume Suicide Note by Amiri Baraka, who published this poem in this anthology, which is a very, very famous landmark anthology in helping to define the move to postmodernism in American poetry. Now, the big problem with this anthology is it is by far and away dominated by white men. And in fact, Amiri Baraka, who was at the time writing under his name Leroy Jones, I'm pretty certain is the only or possibly only 2 Black writers included in the entire collection. And yet, in many respects, this poem for me became like one of the most memorable poems written out of this period. To start, we already have the title, right? And this is what a lyric move permits that a documentary move does not necessarily. It's that the meaning of the event kind of changes as you move through it by virtue of what information the speaker is willing to give us. So Preface to a 20-volume Suicide Note is a kind of a remarkable title because it tells me that if the suicide note is 20 volumes long, then this the speaker has quite a lot to complain about, right? Has quite a lot going on. but also does not maybe feel that suicide so urgently as just the isolated phrase suicide note would. He's really kind of living through this throughout the course of a lifetime, this suicidal impulse. But what's instantly amazing about the poem to me too is that it's written for Kelly Jones, who is his daughter, who was born on the 16th of May, 1959, and that's prominently displayed in the poem. And in the original book, what's also interesting, that's on the other shelf, so I'll skip it. At the bottom of the page, it says 1957, which suggests that this poem was written and published 2 years before Kelly Jones was born. So in that, everything starts to dilate and stretch, right? We don't know how real or imaginary this entire moment is. And that's actually a really important note. And I want to pause there for a minute in terms of a suggestion about craft. I think we too often, when we write in this lyric mode, in this first person mode, we have a tendency to kind of default to the facts, right? We default to, I'm talking about myself, this thing that actually happened to me, so I got to tell the truth. What the title, the dedication, and in its original publication, that year at the bottom of the poem, all work together to make clear is that the facts are really fuzzy here. And I kind of like that. I prefer that, right? I don't want my impulse towards the lyric to kind of bind me to being caught between a reporter and a poet, right? And so what Amiri Baraka does in this poem is he lets in some space for the imagination. And in fact, it turns out that at least if those dates are accurate, which I mean, certainly the birth of his daughter, I'm sure is accurate, but that 1957 date that hangs there, then all of this is imaginary. None of this has really occurred. So the poem, which I'll read kind of quickly here, is lately I've become accustomed to the way the ground opens up and envelops me each time I go out to walk the dog, or the broad-edged silly music the wind makes when I run for a bus. Things have come to that. And now each night I count the stars, and each night I get the same number. And when they will not come to be counted, I count the holes they leave. Nobody sings anymore. And then last night, I tiptoed up to my daughter's room and heard her talking to someone. And when I opened the door, there was no one there. Only she on her knees, peeking into her own clasped hands. So we have this entire sequence of the speaker going through this depression that has him contemplating suicide at the outset, and it ends with his daughter praying without a lot of conviction or devotion, right? She's talking to herself, she's praying, but she's peeking to see if anybody's in there. It's such a poignant and touching poem, and I think the thing, though, that is the kind of major craft point that I want to make from this is, again, going back to that sense that this is all real, but that fuzziness about which of the facts and details are accurate and which aren't. I really try to encourage my students and anybody who has a preference for the lyric mode to start to embrace this notion that you don't have to stick to the facts, you just have to be sincere. And if the facts need to change a little bit, that's okay. Because what this mode of writing does is it foregrounds the experience for the reader. And that's the most, maybe the most important thing to take away from this is the lyric mode may favor the I, it may always be a first person poem, but really what we're doing there is trying to make a poem that is about the reader more than it is about the I. We want the reader to recognize us in some way as they encounter this work. From there, I want to move to the crisis described. And this is a narrative model, and this is also, you know, a major part of American poetry. And it, you know, the narrative model, of course, you all know what that is, just a poem that tells a story, whether it's first person or third person. The slight difference between the lyric and narrative as I'm presenting them is that the narrative, it seems, is actually a bit more factual, right? It's less a meditation in the mind and more a description of the self moving through events or characters moving through events. So here, I decided to look at a poem by Yusuf Komunyakaa called Hanoi Hannah. And a little background on this: Komunyakaa, who is just an amazing poet, did a tour of duty in Vietnam in, I can't remember if it's I think it was 68 to 69. And during that time that he was there as a black man in Vietnam, and I don't actually recollect whether he was drafted or volunteered. I suspect he was drafted. During that time, Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. I don't recall for sure if he was there before or after the Kennedy assassination, but it becomes such an important part of his work, all of that confluence of race and politics and geopolitics. And yet this poem does a really interesting thing. It tells a story, and it tells a story about Hanoi Hannah. And if you don't know any of the history about who this character is, Hanoi Hannah is basically a propaganda tool. She was a character devised by the North Vietnamese. They played music. Basically, she was a DJ. They played music that people really wanted to listen to, American soldiers would really want to listen to, but in between each song, she was trying to decrease and lower morale. And one of the things that they really focused on via Hanoi Hannah was racial difference and racial strife among the Americans. Hanoi Hannah was constantly reminding Black soldiers that they were not being treated as equal in their own country. And in another poem in this book, the book from which this poem I'm going to show you comes, Hanoi Hannah makes direct reference to the assassination. There are leaflets thrown that are sprayed upon the soldiers that say the VC, the Viet Cong, did not kill Martin Luther King Jr. So the sort of underlying tension of race and place and context is really remarkable in Komunyakaa's work. And the thing that I want to kind of go back to that title, the description of this lecture that I originally pitched, is that think about this subject matter, Vietnam. This is not a small subject. Everybody in this period is writing and thinking about it. And Komunyakaa, yet somehow in the midst of all of that, finds his own singular perspective on it, finds his own way of giving us insight. So I'm going to read this poem quickly. Hanoi Hannah. Ray Charles. His voice calls from waist-high grass, and we duck behind gray sandbags. Hello, soul brothers. Yeah, Georgia's also on my mind. Flares bloom over the trees. Here's Hannah again. Let's see if we can't light her goddamn fuse this time. Artillery shells carve a white arc against dusk. Her voice rises from a hedgerow on our left. It's Saturday night in the States. Guess what your woman's doing tonight? I think I'll let Tina Turner tell you, you homesick GIs. Howitzers buck like a herd of horses behind concertina. You know you're dead men, don't you? You're dead as king today in Memphis. Boys, you're surrounded by General Tran Do's division. Her knife-edged song cuts deep as a sniper's bullet. Soul brothers, what are you dying for? We lay down a white Klieg trail of tracers. Phantom jets fan out over the trees. Artillery fire zeroes in. Her voice grows flesh, and we can see her falling into words, a bleeding flower no one knows the true name for. Your lousy shots, GIs. Her laughter floats up as through the airway, as though the airways are buried under our feet. And so the distinction between this and the lyric model is really that it falls somewhere between documentary and lyric, right? It tells the story, it presents the facts. The speaker is kind of halfway important, right? We need to know the speaker is actually witnessing this event. The speaker must have credibility, but the speaker's feelings are not necessarily the primary focus. The speaker's observations are the primary focus. And so you can see that what Kumanyaka ends up doing is using a little bit of what I mentioned when I was talking about the documentary style of using found text, found language that he's hearing over the radio. But he focuses on that found voice in the same way that he focuses on the descriptions of the battle itself, of guns blazing and explosions and things like that. All of it is highly imagistic. Everything is treated as an image. And in that sense, the narrative poem, the narrative mode, functions a lot like a landscape painting is an analogy that I've always used, that where a lyric poem is something of a self-portrait from painting, the world of painting. The narrative poem is very much a landscape or a scene or a still life, and it wants to be very kind of mindful of the details while also being mindful of where those details are being observed from. So, and this is another style of poem. This is when I stopped putting the list together of recommended writers, because I suddenly realized I could list like literally hundreds and hundreds of poems who write in this sort of narrative style. But this is the one I chose just because it has always been such a memorable poem to me, and as somebody who was born after Vietnam, does not have a real deep personal connection to that era or that moment. The kind of way in which I feel educated by this poem, and in such a memorable way, it almost, this poem did more for me when I read it than like half a semester of a history class about this era. Like, I understood so much of it so much better. And so I think that speaks again to the power of this style and mode of writing. So that brings us to a style that I tend to deploy a lot in my own work, and one that just I kind of have, for whatever reason, a weird affinity for. And that I decided to call this the crisis contorted, a fabulist or surrealist model. So fabulism in fiction generally refers to stuff that's very extremely made up, you know, it can be really off the wall, but it's a kind of magical realist mode too, where the random stuff that happens, you're not really going to have like, you know, talking tomatoes and you know, things like that. You might have a little bit of that, but for the most part, we're in the realm of the real world. It's just, everything's a little messed up, like almost as if the poet is on a psychedelic drug or something, right? And the idea there, this all comes out of the early 20th century writing in France and in Italy and in Spain, where surrealism in painting and poetry was really kind of rose up. And it rose up, strangely enough, out of Sigmund Freud, the sort of inquiries of Freud, where this notion that there was a consciousness and a subconsciousness, some idea underneath the surface, that was just as revelatory as our kind of self-aware minds, that kind of in art births this idea of surrealism, that maybe if I paint dreams and if I paint random thoughts and associations I have with a subject, that might reveal something about the subject. In the US, writers are not quite, I mean, at least the surrealist writers that I'm most familiar with are not quite so surrealist as, like, say, if you're picturing like a painting by Dali or somebody like that. It's not quite that off the wall. In fact, most American surrealists tend to hew pretty close to a recognizable subject. They just change a lot of the details in a way that kind of refreshes and revises the subject in a certain way. So the poem I chose for this is, because I mentioned him the other day, is a poem by David Berman from his only book, Actual Air. April 13th, 1865, history aficionados in the audience here will recognize that date as being weirdly, but not quite, the date that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. And I triple checked this because it's a little bit like the preface to a 20-volume suicide note in the sense that the date that Lincoln was actually shot was April 14th. And so it's almost as if from the very beginning, the poet is kind of winking at you, sort of saying, this isn't quite right. It's a little bit off. And this is a little bit blurry because I expanded it in the PowerPoint. But April 13th, 1865. At first, the sound had no meaning. The shot came from the balcony as if the play had sprung an annex. And I, John Sleeper Clark, pictured stars through oak scaffolds as the news traveled over the chairscape like a stain. In that dark room lit by gas jets, the Welshman to my left conceded the armrest we'd been fighting over, and doctors and half-doctors flowed into the scarlet aisles to help. I did not take to the image of a bay mare waiting in the alley or a manhunt through Maryland. I remember standing up as the others did, and how the assassin was in mid-air when the stagehand wheeled out clouds. So here, I hope it becomes pretty evident that David Berman was not in the audience at the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Instead, the entire scene is imagined via this character that he invents, John Sleeper Clark, who is obviously, it's a joke, a riff on this from 19th century inclusion of the middle name. And the entire reality of the assassination is sort of called into question by the title, but then also by this perspective where nobody could really tell what was going on. We heard a shot, and maybe for a moment you think that this is part of the play occurring over there. And even the assassin. Now, part of the details here, by the way, are totally accurate. John Wilkes Booth did ride a mare that was waiting for him in the alley, and there was a manhunt through Maryland where they eventually, I think they caught him. I can't remember how that all played out, if it was in Maryland or elsewhere. But at any rate, some of the details here are accurate. Some of the details here are completely fabulized, completely invented. I don't even know if the stagehands would have been wheeling out clouds in this play. I don't, there are things we just can't know. But then there's the little detail, the dark room lit by gas jets, and the Welshman to my left conceded the armrest we've been fighting over. Just the sort of moments of recognition from contemporary life juxtaposed. I think of being on an airplane when you're fighting over the armrest. And so what this does in our address of crisis, where Kumanyaka takes on a big subject, the Vietnam War, and personalizes it, and Amiri Baraka takes on what feels like the weight of being a black man in this country and having a child and a daughter there, and the way that Claudia Rankine takes the murders of black men at the hands of police, and they each approach those very, very big subjects in their manner. There's this other way of doing it too. The assassination of Abraham Lincoln, of course, is not a small subject in the history of this country, and many would argue that's part of everything that's still happening today. What I think is interesting about this poem is the way in which it, by being so kind of fantastical, it somehow humanizes the event by placing us in it in a way that we wouldn't be able to experience otherwise, while retaining a certain kind of ironic distance from that subject. So it lets us observe not just the event in history, like we remember that, but we also feel, in essence, like we are briefly, even though we all know it's imaginary, that we're a part of it, and that's what the surrealist mode can do, is it can locate you in different parts of an event, of a room, of a crisis, that you wouldn't ordinarily have access to if you were sticking to a narrative model or a documentary model or a lyric model, where you kind of have to stick to the facts. This poem does what Amiri Baraka's poem does, but to an nth degree. It takes it to another degree. poets who do this are among some of my favorites. I mentioned the other day at the Meet the Mentor thing. Mary Ruefle does some of this. James Tate certainly does some of this. Matea Harvey does some of this. There's, Dean Young, who I actually studied with as an undergrad, does a lot of this. But it's this sort of melding of fact with fiction and the opportunities that then offers. So how am I doing on time? Not too bad. Okay. So this next part is the crisis as artifact and the artifacts of crisis. And I'm calling this a postmodern model. I can almost put postmodern in quotes. The book, in fact, that we could look at is this one by Diana Hoy Nguyen called Ghost of. And she has actually a couple of these in the book, these triptychs that are comprised of a photograph and 2 pieces of text. In this book, the book really centers around the loss of the speaker's brother and the sort of negotiation of him not being there anymore and the grief around that. And she does a kind of just an amazing thing, and this is born of the tradition that you will know as concrete poetry, where poems sort of take the shapes of the objects they're describing, but Nguyen takes this in a completely kind of rich and different direction. I tried to get all 3 pages to make an actual triptych on the same page, but I couldn't. I still was not successfully able to make that writing legible, but I do have PDFs of all these poems that I can make available afterwards. So you can read, and I'll read what's in these segments. I actually have to grab a book to do that. Okay, so you can see the first panel of the triptych is what appears to be a family photograph in which a figure is cut out. And then on the next, and in the book, it actually, the photograph appears on 1 page, and then this is what the next 2 pages look like on this spread. So you see the figure from the photograph, that shape defined by text, and then that shape missing from the other text. And in order to do this, there's some really amazing kind of strange enjambments internal to words even, so that the first lines, if you can barely make that out, it looks like it says with E, yes, close, D, he waits. But of course, if you want to read it as a sentence, it's, I'll read the whole thing. With eyes closed, he waits for his body to do the same. A fistful of grains, rice let go from the hand of a symbolist. First, the rainstorm, then trio of crickets, a stream, then a trickle like someone who has the hands of a mother or father to guide him. But the house is empty. He is emptying out every hour, all hours before his death. He is dangerously close to living. His body is warm, his mind cool. What are the tricks for warming? He no longer feels the watch against his wrist. He no longer feels a wrist. He no longer. So that's in this portion of the figure. And on the other half of the page is the rest of the photograph, effectively, from the first panel. What may exist between appearance and disappearance, between sound and silence, as something that is nearly nothing. Slow music, quiet music, spare music. Of sound and form, I fell asleep tonight after feeding us both. It was hard to think of you. Cold, it was hard to think of you. Think it was hard to think of you. It was hard to think. While I slept, soundful, the wind howled and wet its whistling teeth. It has sound, but no form. What has a form but no sound? There is no sound for everyone. Not everyone has a sound. There is no sound, for there is no sound. Therefore, everyone is there, anyone between the sound and the silence. Some solitary figure ambling along the loop. No sound. No sound in which the performer is silent. He is a point departing. No sound overtaking sound to the verge of vanishing. No sound, not one. No one silhouetted against the empty scores. No duration to mark, but still a space to occupy, an occupation. Tonight I fed you first, then myself, then fell asleep. We have departed from the cage. That is not a space we occupy. A sister who is dreaming becomes a sister in another sister's dream, momentarily forgetting that music is playing. Something startled me, a voice in the room I thought was empty. Did you jump over? Did you jump back, over, and back? Did you jump back, did you? Over here, I stretched the replay across the year and longer. It keeps me alive, it keeps me alive. It keeps alive, it keeps me alive, it keeps me alive, it keeps me alive, it keeps me alive, it keeps. So a difficult poem, honestly, to read because I can feel myself getting kind of choked up when I read it. But I wanted to offer this as a completely other possibility when we take on subject in poetry. This, as you can tell, just from these two slides, is an extremely visual kind of model here, and it really starts to break down the boundary between poetry and visual artifact. And then, of course, the content of the poem brings in this entire other element of sound and feeling, a feeling of presence or lack of presence. It's amazing to me just how this book, for a book that is simply magically visual throughout, how it doesn't permit its visualness and its effects that it uses to neglect the actual writing, the craft of writing, and it presents all these visual artifacts, but then writes out and describes all the other senses too. The reason that this is a postmodern mode or model is because of the way in which it makes its artifice really evident. A lot of poems are written in a way where they forget that they're poems, or we're meant to forget that they're poems, right? You kind of describe everything you want your reader effectively in like a virtual reality helmet almost. Like the way you've written it, they should just forget that the glasses and the headphones are there. Now they're living inside your own head, or some kind of effect like that. What the postmodern move does is it constantly reminds us that we're looking at a piece of art, negotiating a subject. So it's almost like watching someone watch TV, if that makes sense. You're like behind them and watching the audience experience the thing, while also studying the TV and not just what's on it. This is getting really abstract, so sorry. I could go on for like a half an hour on postmodernism, but I'm not going to. The point is that the poem as an object, or maybe better put, the poem becomes an object all in and of itself, in addition to all the content it presents. So finally, I want to bring us to this idea of the crisis remembered, the crisis forgotten, which I kind of made up this model. It's called an historical imaginary model. And the reason I made it up is because, one, it allowed me to feature a poem that I absolutely adore. But two, it made me realize that so much of our writing about crisis is not written from the perspective of the witness or the first-hand account. I think of everything that is going on right now, so long as I myself am not sort of ill with the coronavirus, or nor do I necessarily know or I'm close to anybody who has lost their life to the coronavirus, I am ostensibly watching the coronavirus from a certain distance, right? And similarly, the experiences of Black men in this country are not my experiences. I have experiences that may be adjacent, that may be empathetic, that may feel like solidarity and advocacy, but they're not the same. And so a lot of the ways in which we write about crisis, we write from the perspective of a kind of removed observer. And I think that one of the common mistakes writers make is that they forget that they're in that position. And that's when you get into trouble where a writer appropriates. When we talk about appropriation or kind of writing about things that, you may not have the authority or right to write about, it's often born of the sort of forgetting that though you're witnessing this, you are still slightly removed and protected. And the reason I chose to call this an historical imaginary model is because I think that a really helpful rule of thumb here is that imagine writing about some historical event. You weren't there, right? None of us were there for a certain, whether it's a war or it's, an assassination or any kind of thing that happens in another country or in another space. And so what we're left doing is feeling empathy for what's happening and having this desire to write about it, but we sometimes forget the fact that we're not really part of the story. So how do you negotiate that? Writers do it constantly. This poem is by Wisława Szymborska. It's a Nobel laureate, and it's one of my favorite poems of all time, and it's called The End and the Beginning. And in this poem, she really it's like a poem I want to hang up on my wall every time I think to write about a big subject. It reminds me that, right, I'm not part of the story, and I have to kind of be respectful of that. And so here is this poem, and then I'll just wrap up, and I think we're so far right on time. The End and the Beginning. After every war, someone has to tidy up. Things won't pick themselves up after all. Someone has to shove the rubble to the roadsides so the carts loaded with corpses can get by. Someone has to trudge through sludge and ashes, through the sofa springs, the shards of glass, the bloody rags. Someone has to lug the post to prop the wall. Someone has to glaze the window, set the door in its frame. No sound bites, no photo opportunities, and it takes years. All the cameras have gone to other wars. The bridges need to be rebuilt. The railroad stations too. Shirt sleeves will be rolled to shreds. Someone, broom in hand, still remembers how it was. Someone else listens, nodding his unshattered head. But others are bound to be bustling nearby who'll find all that a little boring. From time to time, someone still must dig up a rusted argument from underneath a bush and haul it off to the dump. Those who knew what this was all about must make way for those who know little, and less than that, and at last, nothing less than nothing. Someone has to lie there in the grass that covers up the causes and effects with a cornstalk in his teeth, gawking at clouds. So I absolutely adore that poem. That's another one that I get choked up reading, which I just discovered again. So it's a strange sequence. It starts so gruesome and so much like that poem by Rankin or that poem by Kumanyaka, where it's very much witnessing the horrors of the war in its first few stanzas, but it starts to shift over time, and it starts to shift into aftermath. Until it eventually kind of moves through that almost sort of like Amiri Baraka's poem, sort of describing the someone broom in hand, remembering how it was, and someone else listening, nodding his unshattered head. And then it really moves, in my mind, into that sort of space of that poem by Berman, where we're kind of imagining something, and it's a little bit fabulous, because what's really haunting, I think, about these last couple of stanzas is that when I think of this character in the last two stanzas, the one who knows less than nothing, I think of my own son, my own baby, who will not know about any of the things that we are so upset about and things that are happening to us and have happened before. And that character lying in the grass there could be him lounging on a beautiful day in this space where there was once a war. The other really haunting and terrible thing about that image is that it could also be describing a corpse underneath that grass that's covered up the cause and effects with the cornstalk in his teeth. It's just such a brilliant poem that approaches the abstract subject of crisis from so many different angles and manages so many different effects, that I'm going to be in awe of this one till the end of my life. It's just the simplicity of the language too, and this is in translation, by the way, but the purity of the language always strikes me. And the reason I wanted to conclude here is just to remind us to ask ourselves, when we write about crisis, where are we in relation to it? Are we part of its aftermath? Are we part of its making? Are we among those who are trying not to forget it? Or are we among those who have forgotten it altogether? So I think with being mindful of time, that's a good place to stop. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. And yeah, so I'm happy to take any questions or thoughts from anybody who's interested. And thank you for listening.
Okay, so if anyone has a question or thought, please put it in the chat. I'll start with Kelly Hauer, who said, "The arc of this presentation, Craft Talk, has been amazing and moving. It's moved my brain and my heart, and it may move the poetry of a lot of us watching."
Well, thank you, Kelly. That's great. Yeah, I mean, the idea was I didn't want to. I'm not saying anything revolutionary. I just wanted to remind us all of the different, you know, tools, I guess, for lack of a better word, at our disposal when we sit down to write, especially about big, difficult subjects that we care about.
And if you have any questions, please raise your blue hand. You can feel free to unmute yourself if I see your blue hand, or put a question in the chat.
This is always, I've discovered this is really weirder than a real life Q&A, because everyone's just sort of sitting there in their own homes going like, should I do it? Should I click? Should I not? Maybe,
yeah, so Alicia Escobedo said, "I really appreciated where this presentation ended with a reminder to meditate on where we are in relation to the crisis we may want to tackle in our writing." And Indu has a question. "Can you say a bit about using multiple models in the same poem? Can that work?"
Yeah, that was, I mean, it's so funny because I thought about doing something like that, like adding a seventh category, which is the one that I can't describe yet, you know, and that's in many ways, maybe the most exciting thing from the perspective of the artist. Like, is there a way for me to discover some entirely new modality? And I love the way that question is presented, because in fact, the answer to the question is yes. In fact, most new art forms are created by hybridizing existing art forms. We rarely invent something out of nothing. It's usually when a writer or a painter or a filmmaker or a musician discovers something new. Invariably, it's because they went to the right museum, they read the right book at the right moment, and grabbed something and deployed it in a way that nobody else had thought to deploy it before. So the answer, Indu, is yes, absolutely. You can use multiple models in the same poem. The thing that we always have to be mindful of, and I almost feel like I'm talking to myself when I say this, is to not maybe let, especially when we're writing about crisis, when we're writing about a difficult subject matter that matters to a lot of people beyond just us, I think we have to remain mindful of not letting the gameplay or the artifice of being a poet in any way become disrespectful to the subject. So long as that isn't happening, so long as it's not just about, hey, I'm having fun, and let me think of an example of where that happens. I think it's something that like a filmmaker like Quentin Tarantino has come under fire for a lot because he tends to deploy like the wizardry of filmmaking about really serious subject matter. And for some audiences, that's really refreshing and insightful. And for others, it can really be disrespectful and harmful. So I think we just have to be a little bit careful when we do it, but absolutely, you can use multiple models. I don't see why not. I feel like I do it all the time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Kelly Hauer has a question. Can you mention a couple of collections that successfully blend the lyric and the narrative? The quote, "This poem is true in essence, but not literally true," unquote, with the quote, "This is poetic and also actual," unquote.
Yeah, so I mean, there are so many poets. I mean, shoot, I think like Victoria, I think of some of your work even, or you
And
know,
you're going to do that.
I know, but like, how could I not? Like, you know, I mean,
Because I'm sitting right in front of you.
I know you're right there, and it's not just, but like, you know, maybe I should go back to where we some of the stuff that I asked you to read ahead of time, in terms of like so-called canonical works, but like somebody like Frank O'Hara is really famous for writing things that actually happened but maybe didn't actually happen. There are a lot of details, a lot of facts, dates, names, places, but we can never really tell for sure if everything that's included there is real. But you know, I think as somebody who writes in a way that like where this is poetic and also actual, I think of God, there's so many people, but like Ada Limon is a writer who I feel like is always in this sort of space of like Natalie Diaz is certainly in this space too, of like writers who this is fact, but it is it sort of becomes artistry all at once. Yes, Eve Ewing. Yeah, there are all kinds of.
Roden Coste Lewis, yeah, The Voyage of Sable Venus.
Yes, yes.
Doug Brown mentioned.
Yeah, there are so many. There are so many books, you know, and I bet when we go into our workshops, you know, each of you, there'll be a poem or two we can find that is doing this. It's such a you know, a mode. It's such a primary mode. I'm looking at Terrence Hayes' book, American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin, right in front of me, you know, where it's just, it absolutely is true, but is it factual? I don't know, you know. That's Juan Felipe Herrera is right underneath that same thing, you know. So I have like a stack of books that I'm looking at. Keats, I don't know, Keats is right there too. So so yeah, so sorry if that's too big of an answer, but yeah, that's all over.
Wanda Coleman, Doug Brown mentioned, Dan Bella mentioned, Layli Long Soldier,
Oh, yeah,
whereas.
Yeah.
I put James Wright because I was thinking about personal narrative, but I guess if we're talking more about sort of this really happened kind of thing.
But yeah,
Sarah House wrote, "I recently read Of Color, your forthcoming essay collection. Fantastic exclamation point. And I'm curious how you apply these mediations and the play of form in an essay. Do these considerations come into play for you? How?"
No, it's sort of a funny thing. I am a very much an accidental essayist. I will admit that to anybody who will listen. I didn't mean to write a book of essays. I didn't even mean to write the first essay. I was asked to do participate in a round table on poetry and race, and this was during the moment right after when Claudia Rankin talked about Tony Hoagland's poem "The Change" at AWP, and you know, this actually got a lot of notice even outside of poetry, a little bit. But there was at a poetics website called Evening Will Come, the editor Joshua Marie Wilkinson, the poet, asked a bunch of us to participate in this roundtable. I started writing my little bit for it. It just got longer and longer. It turned into an essay called Writing Like a White Guy. And then from there, I got asked to write other essays. And now 10 years later, there's this book. But I think that the one thing that I'll just try to keep it short on poetry versus nonfiction. There are in both, the thing that's similar in both is I never know what my position is when I sit down to write. I always think I have a vague idea of what I'm going to be writing about, but it's the actual writing that helps to clarify and articulate what I think in both cases. The weird thing for me, though, is when I sit down to write a poem, if I have the title ahead of time, the poem will fail. Invariably, can't do it, can't be done. It completely locks me up. It makes me think way too much in a linear fashion. and I cannot turn a poem out of that. Whereas with essay, I always have the title at the beginning. I always kind of know that this is, and all that does for me is it helps to sort of define my subject and remind me to stay in that subject. Because when you're writing, especially about race and class and things like this, I mean, you know, that book that I wrote is like this big. It could be a library. It is a library. It's just one contribution to a long, massive dialogue on race among many, many people. So the thing in an essay is I am trying to make an argument in both genres. I rarely know what that argument is exactly going to be. But in essay, I have not really delved into formal experiment nearly as much. My essays are much more repertorial. And for that, like, you know, I could direct anybody who's interested in nonfiction to a number of friends of mine who have, you know, who write essays and who are very much creative nonfiction people who are dabbling in different kinds. Dinty Moore is a really good friend of mine who's one of the kind of strangely one of the earliest sort of people in the MFA world and not creative nonfiction, and he does all kinds of wonderful stuff with lists and maps and different kinds of experimental forms for essays, letters, and, you know, also conventional lyric essays. But there are dozens of essays. But yeah, I hope that answers the question. It's kind of a long-winded answer, but yeah. I can't believe I got that in.
Victoria, you're muted.
Yeah, I know, I'm muted. Any other questions? And
Douglas,
gosh, we should have a count how many times you're going to hear that.
Oh,
You're muted. We can't hear you. We can't hear you. You're muted.
Douglas has his hand up.
Awesome. Go ahead, Doug.
No, I was just going to say just your distinction between how you write a poem and your nonfiction. That's the beauty of like the models that you gave us, is that there's like this really, whether they find themselves in the poem or describing it, there's like this beautiful interrogation of the self, despite in lieu of what's going on around them. And that there's this wonderment that they're trying to figure it out. I was kind of, you know, disturbed a little bit by the Stevens, the Stevens quote or paraphrase that Matthew Zapruder used at first. And then when you talked about, well, you know, you might need humor, you might need to humanize yourself to use and break open your imagination. And that's what we are called to do as artists. And I like that responsibility. And it made me rethink, okay, maybe Stevens could be all right, because, you know, he's living in the world of racism and might, in his own idea of the real, he's not dealing with it. He's going somewhere else to these greater things of crisis where we're always living in a time of so-and-so called crisis if we're not dealing with these things. But I'm glad that the examples that you use show this real deep, rich interrogation.
Thank you, Doug. No, and I think the one thing I want to dovetail off of that is just to say that I think my intent as a faculty member in an MFA program is, if there's one way to sum up my pedagogy, it has been to replicate for students a process that I've had to go through over 25 years as a writer, which is the constant attempt to diminish my actual ego, like my egoistic relation to the work. Because when the essay about occasional poetry that I sent you all to, and in addition to Zapruder's essay, is, you know, this sort of attempt at both writers is saying we've got to include a totality of human experience, right? Of humor and weirdness and grossness and all this stuff. And I think that what keeps us from doing that sometimes is this fear of like, what are other people going to think about me, or this desire for other people to pay attention to us. But by focusing on form, on craft, I hope what ends up happening is that it helps to illustrate how much writing poetry isn't about us. It's about the thing we're writing about. That ends up mattering so much more. And I truly feel that for the writers who I adore, who they find success, you know, in various ways, that, like, however we define success. But I think the reason that they're like successful in my heart is because they have made my concerns and my interests central to their project. It's not just about them. And the poets that I tend to shy away from and don't like as much are the ones where I just get this like sneaking suspicion that this is sort of an aggrandizement of the ego, or it's an attempt at like getting a career and getting a job and getting tenure and getting money and all those things. And all those things are necessary and important and wonderful if they work out. But when we sit down to write, craft and subject and audience, I feel like need to come first somehow. So, so sorry, Doug, I didn't mean to like hijack anything you said, but it just to sort of, what you said made me think of that. Like, why do we need humor? Why do we need other kinds of dimensionality and texture to our writing? And I think it's because it's not really about us. It's about the totality of the human experience, and the human experience has all of those elements, you know. So yeah, so sorry, hopefully that helps.